Hello, my name's Simon Swift and I am a lecturer in critical and cultural theory at the School of English in the University of Leeds. But I lecture on a very large first-year module about the reading of prose texts. So that's why I'm giving you this podcast today, because I've got some expertise around the reading of traditional prose texts in particular. And the title of this podcast is Reading Against the Grain. Are traditional texts always what they seem? And it's the first of two podcasts on this topic. And in this podcast, I'm going to be talking around Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, a ghost story from the 1890s. And in the other podcast, I'll be talking about Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. So let's begin with Turn of the Screw. I want to use this podcast to reflect on the kinds of assumptions that we bring to our reading of literary texts, and especially traditional literary texts, in inverted commas, by which I mean broadly texts, novels, stories, poems that were written before the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm going to be talking about a 19th century text in this podcast. And one way of thinking of a literary text, quite a common way of thinking of a literary text, is as a kind of a box, and a box that we as readers open up to find out what is inside. So one way of imagining a literary text is as a sort of a box that has things inside of it. And we as readers, our job, we imagine, is to open up that box and to look inside and to take things out, have a look at them. So let's imagine the 19th century novel as a kind of a box. And let's imagine reading that novel as the process of opening the box to find out what is inside. The assumption here, presumably, is that there is something very interesting inside of the box that we want to get out. And the job of the reader, as I say, is to open the box, rummage around, and take those things out of it. What might we find in the box? All kinds of things, usually. Perhaps different types of secrets, repressed sexual desires, family stories, things that have been hidden away. Perhaps we may think of the box as containing things that the author has put in there, things that the author even has hidden in the box. Something about themselves. And often too, when we think about traditional texts, we think in terms of character and plot. That seems to be a very common way of reading literary texts, to think about the characters and to think about the plot. So we could also imagine this box in terms of character. We could imagine the character in a text as a kind of a box that contains things inside of it. We think of our job as readers as to read the character and to take those things out of the box. So you could take the example of the governess from The Turn of the Screw as this box, as a character, as a kind of a box, as a container who holds all kinds of motivations, intentions, desires, dreams, and wishes. But I think there's a kind of a problem with this approach, which is to say that we risk forgetting about the box itself. If we become too fixated, too focused on what's inside of it, we forget all about the box. The box is something that we just kind of discard in our interest in finding out what's inside of it. We might even think of the box as something that gets in the way, as something that hides what is most interesting and what is most important about the text. So what is the box? If I'm arguing that we think of what's inside of the box as most interesting, as the juicy, interesting stuff, then what is the box itself? Well, one way of thinking about the box is to imagine that it is the story, or what we might call the narrative. And I'm going to go on to think about what the implications of that might be in this podcast. And I'm going to argue that, in a way, texts are never quite what they seem, and that we should always challenge ourselves and our preconceptions about what they are. And we should perhaps be a bit wary of our desire always to go beneath the surface, to try and find out what is hidden inside of the box. So I'd want to encourage you not to think of the story as the bit that you throw away, as it were, in favour of something more interesting, something which is inside the story. I'd want to encourage you, and I'm going to suggest some ways of doing this, to think about the story as a story, to pay attention to the story as a story. And I'm also going to suggest that The Turn of the Screw by Henry James is a story which does just that. That you can understand The Turn of the Screw as a story which is about reading stories. It's a story about stories, and which challenges us to read stories more carefully. Here is a quick tip from me about the reading of English literature. Always give really careful attention to the first thing that you read when you open the book. Sometimes authors write prefaces at the beginnings of their novels or their stories. Read those prefaces really carefully. If there's not a preface, or even if there is a preface, make sure that you spend a lot of time with the very first sentence of the novel or of the story. I think we often think that what happens later on in a story, what happens later on in a narrative, is the interesting, important bit where things start to get resolved, where things start to become clear. And we may think of the beginning of a narrative as scene setting, as starting things up, which it is, of course. But we do have a tendency, I think, very often to glide over the beginning of the story in our rush to get to the juicy details, the meat of the story. So spend time with the first sentence, with the preface, with the very first chapter of any story.